Are we seeing a noticeable pickup in mergers and acquisition activity as the world gets onto a sounder economic footing?
Absolutely, there was. I think there was a good mix of deals. I think particularly around the equity capital market transactions, there were quite a number of fairly attractive and nice sized sort of IPOs, listings, and also there was a good degree of foreign interest in local companies. So yeah.
And what were the main drivers? So you talked about foreign interest in local companies, and we have seen a number of companies approaching South Africa as a gateway into Africa. We've seen that with I think NTT buying Dimension Data. We've seen it with Walmart trying to buy Massmart, a deal that still has to be finalized.
Yeah.
But it looks like South Africa as a gateway into Africa is one of those drivers.
Well, I think that's definitely a theme. I think the theme of being a gateway into Africa is a theme. I think the fact that emerging markets are certainly more flavour of the month than perhaps they've been in the past. And Africa as an interesting emerging market, I think is certainly more flavour of the month than it used to be, perhaps. I do also think renewed interest in resources and potentially a resource super cycle that's coming again will make the likes of the Chinese investor and the Indian investor particularly interested in Africa, and to the extent that South Africa offers a gateway, I think certainly in South Africa as well. But also good to see, typically developed market investors like NTT and the Walmarts coming into South Africa as well. That's certainly been somewhat less of a feature in the past. So it's good to see that interest is still there. We see it, we think probably more in the less regulated sectors than we see it in the the very regulated sectors like mining and resources, for instance. But certainly good to see those deals come through.
Just on mining and resources, of course, last year we saw BHP Billiton trying to buy potash in Canada. That was a deal that was eventually turned down by the Canadian government due to national interests. Do you think that national interests are going to stop big mega resources deals going ahead? Will it be on a smaller scale that we see these deals taking place?
Yeah, it's interesting because you sort of think of government intervention and interference as something that's sort of unique to your country, and you think it's something that you should always be worried about. So it's interesting to note, those things happen in other countries as well, and the sort of things that we often get worried about here are not unique to South Africa. But we think it's an important consideration. It's not something you could and should blindly ignore. So we think it might be a feature not only in the mining and resources space, but I think there are other assets that are of strategic importance to the country, and we think that will always be a question that needs to be answered. And I think there will be, government will probably rightly have a say in what sort of transactions are appropriate and are indeed in the sort of national interest.
We know the financial services sector is of strategic importance to South Africa. The government was, it appears, willing to allow HSBC last year to buy a majority stake in Nedbank. That deal didn't eventually go through. Do you think the financial services space will still be a space where we do see activity?
I think we've got a very developed and first world financial services space, and I think it's well regulated, and from that point of view I think it's very attractive. So absolutely would expect to continue to see continued interest in this space. As you say, it is a strategically important sector, so and a highly regulated sector, so I would expect to see a high level of government interest to the extent that foreign interest reappears in that space. But certainly I think it's such a high quality sector locally that I would expect to see that, yes.
Is there much more room for merger activity though in the local sector? We've had Momentum merging with Metropolitan. That was a fairly significant deal worth over 20 billion rand, and it means we now have a new champion of insurance, third biggest company in the country in the insurance space. But you don't want to be too small, you don't want to have too few companies, do you?
Yeah, I think probably both on the banking side and the insurance side there's a relatively strong level of consolidation that we already see. Although a number of smaller players do exist, and it's always possible that we'll see further consolidation at that end of the spectrum. But as for big activity between the major players, I suppose that becomes a little bit more difficult to see as the players get bigger.
That Walmart takeover of Massmart, some see that as a precursor to other big foreign retailers coming and looking at South African retailers, which are quite expensive at current market levels. Do you expect more activity at these levels, or do you think they would rather look for bargains in other sectors?
I think a bargain is always something that's difficult to assess. You need to assess it relative to the growth that the company offers. So if the theme is a gateway into Africa, and you know, there certainly is very attractive growth in you know, other sort of what might have been previously considered frontier markets. So to the extent that South African retailers, but the same applies in other spaces, present such an opportunity to participate and gain exposure in those markets, absolutely think that people would consider it at whatever sort of level, not whatever level, but certainly at sort of current levels. So indeed, you know, I think our local retailers are certainly by any standards very, you know, well developed and first rate sort of companies.
So buyers might look past the price a little bit.
We think buyers might swallow the price for the exposure and the opportunity to gain exposure up in Africa, indeed.
To what extent would the strength of the rand that we've seen recently perhaps hamper further inward investments into South Africa? There was a rumour during the HSBC Nedbank takeover talks that the strengthening of the rand was one of the factors that made HSBC walk away. Do you think a strong rand like this is a deterrent to investment?
Yeah. I think all other things being equal, I think people will be slightly more cautious of a rand of 680 or 650 sort of where it went to, as opposed to 850. I think the balance of probability probably shifts. So from that point of view, a slight deterrent, but I think people look longer term and look for longer term prospects.
How about black economic empowerment? That was a big driver of M&A activity a few years ago. In fact, back in 2007, 83 billion rands worth of deals concluded. Last year, that falling to 27 billion rand. Do you think this is a trend that's going to continue? It
absolutely is a trend that's going to continue. I think it's going to be a feature of our landscape for a long time. I think we were in that phase where a lot of transactions had been concluded and probably in the phase where they need to run their course. We are getting closer to a period where many deals need to be refinanced and they're coming to a vesting period. And to be fair, I think people are reconsidering whether the models that were used in the past were the right models and did they have the right impact. And when we look at new transactions, you know, the features might be slightly different to ensure that they are sustainable and they serve their purpose in the long term.